Hamish de Bretton-Gordon is a retired British Army colonel, former commander of NATO's and UK's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear reaction troops. Welcome to our program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
Ukraine has hit one of Russia's largest oil refineries in the town of Kyrgyzstan with a drone strike, part of a wider campaign that already has taken out up to 25% of Russia's oil refining capacity. What is your take on that and the assessment of this wider campaign of Ukraine strikes deep inside Russia?
I think the Ukrainian strikes on the sort of logistics hubs and other key things deep in Russia is a really sensible and right thing to do by the Ukrainian military, because Russia absolutely relies on its lines of communication to support its military effort in Ukraine. And by striking the oil industry, and particularly the petrol production facilities, it is bringing the war, the brutal war, home to people in Russia. One sees across social media queues, people having to queue for hours, if not days, to get petrol, and the price of it hugely expensive. So for a lot of Russians who don't get involved in the war and don't know what is happening in their name, this is now bringing it home to them. And there is a lot of unrest across Russia with the fact that people can't get fuel, and if they can get it, it's very expensive. So I think this is a really militarily and strategically a very smart move by the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian forces, because they're now having a real impact. 25% of the oil industry now brought to a standstill. This is the industry that provides most of the foreign currency that is keeping the Russian war machine going. So one hopes that the Ukrainian military will keep up these strikes and bring, this is probably one of the key things to bring the Russian economy to its knees and hopefully bring Putin to the negotiation table.
Do you feel that this way of Ukraine-made sanctions against Russia could also force Putin to make any kind of concessions in the nearest future, because President Trump still hopes that he can reach a deal on Ukraine?
Well, as we've heard President Trump and others talk about sanctions for a long time now. We know that the European Union have put more sanctions on Russia. Unfortunately, sanctions take quite a long time to have an effect. And when you have a tyrant like President Putin, who doesn't really care how much his people are suffering, sanctions which will put up the price of food, put up the price of oil, really have very little impact to people in the Kremlin who are unaffected by these measures. So I think certainly the threat of sanctions, and if people can be prevented from buying Russian oil, which is where Putin's getting most of his money to keep the war machine going, then certainly in the long run that will have a huge impact. But these are long-run things. It's in the short term that really the European NATO countries and the Americans need to bolster Ukraine and support it, because short-term things are going to make a big difference. Sanctions will take a long time, certainly, but it's been so slow to get these sanctions in place, particularly the ones that President Trump controls, that they're having less impact than they should do. So I certainly support additional sanctions on the Russians. We should be sanctioning them much as we can. All the frozen Russian assets in Europe and across the world should be given to Ukraine to enable them to buy more munitions and support their war effort. But ultimately, it is military hardware and military support that Europe and the United States should be giving Ukraine now, rather than waiting for some later date.
Let's also cover this big attack or incursion deep inside the Polish airspace by 19 Russian drones. Prime Minister Donald Tusk said that Poland at this stage was at its closest to open conflict since World War II. What is your assessment of this incursion into Polish airspace, and Was Vladimir Putin trying to test Polish resolve, NATO's resolve, and try to see how will NATO react and how will NATO's capabilities be engaged in this process?
Well, firstly, I think this was no accident at all. I absolutely agree. This was Putin testing NATO, testing the resolve. Some of the comments coming out of some of the other gangsters in the Kremlin, like Medvedev and Peskov, that this was an accident is quite frankly rubbish. These drones and missiles might stray off course by 10, perhaps 100 meters, not 10 or 100 kilometers, as in the case here. So it's definitely Putin testing NATO. And thank heavens, in this case, NATO really came up to the mark here, and those drones were shot down, and very importantly, by not necessarily Polish fighter jets, but as we understand it, by Danish and Greek NATO fighter jets. So that really demonstrated the unity of European NATO countries. So hugely important that they did this. But this is not an isolated incident. Only after that, we saw drones in Romania. Unfortunately, they weren't shot down, Russian drones, that is, and there have been a number of other drones going into NATO airspace in the past. This will not be the last. And when you couple it to the fact that the ZatNap exercise is happening in Belarus at the moment with up to 100,000 Belarusian and Russian troops very close to the Polish border, and an exact replica of the exercises that happened in early 2022, just before the Russians invaded from Belarus into Ukraine. We need to watch this all very, very closely. I think what this incursion does show is that NATO really needs to be more demonstrative in its defence of Ukraine. And I have been calling this week the British government to lead on imposing a no-fly zone, certainly in Western Ukraine, against civilian targets. And NATO has demonstrated that its fighter jets, predominantly F-35s and other stealth jets, are well up to the task. So let's hope that this is a catalyst for NATO to do more, and hopefully maybe a catalyst also for Putin to realise that NATO is serious in defending Ukraine, and maybe this is the thing that will bring him to the peace negotiation table.
Do you feel that the representatives of so-called coalition of the willing could also begin this discussion on possibility of imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine right now?
Well, that is certainly the hope. And after the Russian drone incursion, NATO countries, including the United Kingdom, have moved fighter jets to Poland to help Poland protect their borders. But there is also, from what I understand, serious discussion going on in some of the European NATO headquarters about extending a no-fly zone into Ukraine. Now, this would not be necessarily a unique thing. I was in Iraq in 1991 when NATO imposed a no-fly zone of Saddam Hussein's Iraqi fighter jets that were trying to kill the Kurdish race off. That worked very effectively, and the Kurds were saved. And then only last year, British and French jets knocked down Iranian drones and missiles fired at Israel's civilians. So there is precedent here. And I think there is a growing body of thought that actually this is something that NATO should do. There is huge concern that it would mean that NATO jets and Russian jets coming up against each other. But I think this is comments by people who don't really understand the situation. The Russian Air Force, to me, is pretty much a spent entity. We have seen very little Russian fighter jet activity in Ukraine, and we know that Russian fighter jets, when they come up against stealth jets like the F-35s, are no match for them at all. And speaking to British fighter pilots and people expert in this area say that actually the F-35 jets are also not concerned by Russian air defense like the S-400s, as was demonstrated when the Americans attacked Iranian nuclear sites earlier on this year. So I think in practical terms, NATO could produce a very effective no-fly zone. That is to prevent Russian drones and missiles hitting civilian targets, which seems to be the main aim of the Russians at the moment, to attack civilians. And if that was in place, then we know that Russia is actually going backwards in a lot of areas in the front line, in the Donbass, around Petrovsk and elsewhere at the moment. And, that is more likely to get Putin to the negotiation table, I expect, than any amount of sanctions or any amount of hot air coming out of Western capitals or Washington, D.C.
But do you expect the US administration to also back this idea of a no-fly zone over Ukraine? Because there have been only discussions of about post-war security guarantees for Ukraine, but not about the possibility of closing Ukrainian sky before the fighting stops.
I think most analysts like myself, and I think most people looking at this, are assuming that the Americans would not be involved in a European no-fly zone. What we are assuming is that American intelligence would still be available. And President Trump has suggested that that would be the case. And European NATO fighter jets would require American intelligence to allow them to make sure that they can pick up these missiles and drones as early as possible and to neutralize them, shoot them down before they hit their target. So I think the working assumption is that the American fighter jets wouldn't be involved in any no-fly zone, but their intelligence support would be. And as you say, at the moment, there is only an American military guarantee once we have a ceasefire. And this no-fly zone would be before a ceasefire, I expect, but we were hoping it would be a catalyst leading to a ceasefire because, the Russians and particularly Putin would realize that they were really, to use the chess vernacular, would be in checkmate, as it were.
Do you expect Vladimir Putin to conduct another so-called hybrid attack on NATO countries or another drone attack against Poland or other NATO members in the nearest future?
Yes, I think the assumption is absolutely the Russians will carry on their activity. We know that they're conducting a lot of cyber attacks on various targets in Europe and elsewhere. We know that they're doing a number of sabotage attacks using their security service, their secret services. A lot had been stopped and interdicted, but this is the way the Russians operate. So I think the assumption is they will keep doing that. And they will keep doing that until they're convinced that NATO will react demonstrably against them, which is why it was so important that NATO did shoot down these Russian drones and missiles that were fired at Poland. But I think this is only the first shot, if you like, in this, and one expects the Russians to keep up the pressure and the attacks on NATO countries in Europe until there is some sort of ceasefire and peace deal being negotiated.
Do you expect a ceasefire or any kind of peace deal to be reached this year or at the beginning of next year? What is your assessment of the current stage of so-called negotiations between US administration, Ukrainians and Russians?
Well, I think at the moment that there is no prospect at all. President Putin has shown very clearly since the Alaska summit that he has no interest in peace at all, and is cracking on. And the attacks we've talked about really personify that position. I think the ambiguity coming out of the US in particular and some NATO countries have really exacerbated this and made it worse. It'll be very interesting to see what President Trump says while he's in the UK. This is a key aim of the British government, to try and get Trump to get off the fence, as it were, and be more proactive in trying to get Putin to the peace table. Because his Alaska summit and his meeting of European leaders shortly after that in Washington so far have really come to nothing. In fact, Putin has actually upped his activity, and we've seen more attacks in Ukraine since the Alaska summit than really we've seen before the summit. So, it had a negative effect, if you like. But it seems clear that a lot of the cards sit with President Trump at the moment, and what he decides to do, allied to that, I think European countries are showing a much more unified front now. But I think we need to go a stage further, and a real demonstration of European NATO military power would be to provide a no-fly zone against civilian targets in Ukraine. I know the technical details have been discussed about this in military headquarters around Europe, but whether European politicians have the guts and the gumption to be able to put this in place, is not clear at the moment. We shall see.
You just also mentioned about President Trump. President Trump on Saturday said that he will impose further sanctions on Russia only if all NATO countries place high tariffs on China and stop buying Russian oil. Is this a really new strategic move, or just an excuse to avoid placing sanctions? Because many experts say that this condition is almost certain not to be met, because such countries like Hungary and other European members of NATO, and also like Turkey, they are not going to stop buying Russian oil.
Yes, this is a very strange statement coming out of the White House. It's one can see that most European countries might comply, certainly on the Russian oil perspective. But as you say, countries like Turkey and Hungary and some of the other European countries are highly unlikely to stop buying what is in effect very, very cheap hydrocarbons, which are probably helping their economy. And when it comes to tariffs on China, again, there is not the animosity, I think, in Europe between China that there is between the US and China. The US and China are the world's two superpowers who are trying to vie for position as the leading sort of commercial and business countries in the world. European countries are just not involved in that. So you can't, I wouldn't expect, and I doubt that we'll see European countries putting huge tariffs on China. Perhaps if President Trump lifts the tariffs on European countries, then they might comply in some way. But unfortunately, I think this is a rather crude stalling tactic by President Trump to not sanction the Russians any more than he is at the moment.
Let's also cover some interesting publications about Vladimir Putin's way of life. British newspaper Times reported about the 3 bunkers Vladimir Putin is using to run his country. So Russian dictator Putin is running his country from a series of identical conference rooms, so-called bunkers, according to CIA sources, just to prevent anyone around the globe, prevent any country from identifying his locations. That's why he is running his country from 3 identical bunkers around Russia. What does this say about Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think Putin is fixated by his own security and realizes that he is in the crosshairs, if you like, of probably an awful lot of people. And, they're not all outside Russia. I'm sure there are people in Russia who would like to see the end of Putin for all the destruction that he's done and the destruction he's done to the Russian economy. So it's very clear that his security is almost his main effort. We've seen a lot of air defense assets removed from the front line protecting soldiers to protect his bunkers and his palaces around Russia. And if I purely put my military and strategic hat on, it makes a lot of sense to keep moving and going to different places. But the resources required to protect Putin and to keep his bunkers and palaces going are absolutely massive. And Putin might be well protected in his bunkers, but the young soldiers that he's sending to the front line are not protected at all. And by saving his own life, he is probably condemning thousands of young Russian men to death on the front line. So I think it just shows the sort of person that he is. He's very concerned about his own safety, but he has virtually no concern for the lives of the soldiers that he sends to the front line, and actually generally the civilians in Russia whose economy he's destroyed and who are living a pretty miserable life, where he lords it up in great luxuries in his various palaces and luxury houses and apartments around Russia.
What is your assessment of Vladimir Putin's calculus, his thinking right now? What does he plan to do next, and where he is right now on this war? Is he closer to ending this conflict, to reaching any kind of a ceasefire deal, to settle this war?
Well, I think at the moment Putin has no interest in peace. He very clearly stated his aims really over the last 4 or 5 years, and that was the complete subjugation of Ukraine and also the redrawing of the USSR, the Soviet Union boundaries, some of the old states, the Baltic states and elsewhere, that he thinks should be part of the Russian Federation. He said that so clearly to his people that anything less than that would be a failure. And Putin knows that Russian dictators who fail rarely collect their pension. So at the moment, with a still slightly disunited Europe and US, he keeps going. He's trying to persuade the Russian people that he is winning. But the million casualties so far and the thousands every week really don't back that up at all. And people in Russia are beginning to realize it. We also know, quite apart from, he's desperately short of conscripts. We've discussed the thousands of North Koreans that he had. There are now rumors and rumors with, quite strong precedent that actually they're creating battalions of soldiers now with infectious diseases like tuberculosis and HIV because they are so short of people. And when you look at that, it's easy to come to the conclusion the Russian army is culminating. I've already given my assessment. The Russian Air Force is in a pretty poor state. So all he's got now is drones and missiles to keep firing. And of course, if we put a no-fly zone, that will nullify it. But unfortunately, I think Putin at the moment is just going forward because he sees that President Trump isn't prepared to make any decisions and Europe is still sorting itself out. But it's coming to a realization that, we are at a stalemate, if you like, on the front lines. They haven't moved much at all. In fact, Ukraine's made a lot of progress in the last few weeks. But as Putin hunkers down in his various bunkers around Russia, he's pretty safe. It's not going to affect him, but he wants to keep going. He's still, his legacy as the new Tsar of Russia is something that's very important to him. And he doesn't care how many Russians have to die, to realize that. So I'm afraid at the moment, Putin is keeping on going, and it is only European NATO countries and the US who can support Ukraine to try and make sure that Putin realizes that it's completely futile to keep fighting. But at the moment, that we are not at that position. But let's hope that we will soon.
There are many analysts, also many assessment about for how long can Russia sustain this war effort, for example, for 6, 12 months or for another years. What is your assessment on that? For how long can Russia sustain this effort due to also taking into account current economic problems with shortages of human resources and other different issues regarding the Russian army?
Well, unfortunately, President Putin thinks he can keep going, almost forever. It's difficult for us to understand, if this was the other way around, things would have stopped already. But as Putin doesn't care what he does to Russia, He doesn't care if people can't afford to buy basics like potatoes to eat. He doesn't care how many people are killed. Then, when you have that perspective and you have, an autocratic dictator like Putin, he can keep on going and going and going. So, unfortunately, unless we radically change and increase our support to Ukraine, from a Russian perspective, Putin will keep on going. There is a British military intelligence assessment only a few weeks ago that said that to take the Donbass completely, which what Putin says he'll do, will take 4 years and cost another 2 million Russian lives. Now, to most people in the world, that would not be acceptable, but to Putin, it probably is. So I think Putin and Russia will keep going until they're stopped by Ukraine and hopefully by increased support from NATO and the US.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Glory to Ukraine.